This is why Catholic artists can't just like blindly or like automatically follow. You can follow prevailing forms if you want to, but you can't just follow them like as a matter of course and without thinking about whether it's appropriate to your subject material and what it's conveying about reality. Because like, again, what you end up doing, you may end up like suffocating the truth that you have to offer with like a wineskin
right.
that is like not
right.
appropriate.
This is Criteria. Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. I'm James Majewski here with my co-host, Thomas Miras.
Hello there.
And Thomas, I have a question for you. And this is a serious question.
Oh.
Can you paint with all the colors of the wind?
I can...
Wrong. Okay, today we are talking about Terrence Malick's Pocahontas, also known as The New World.
I couldn't think of a good witty retort to that because I haven't seen Pocahontas since.
Well, you know, Pocahontas does talk about colors in this one. There's a very important.
Why does the Earth have colors?
Yes. And I only made that connection moments before we hit record here.
Interesting. Okay.
So yes, we're continuing our series talking about Terrence Malick, and we're talking about his 2005 masterpiece, as it turns out, The New World, and we're joined here by our regular guest host Nathan Douglas. Hey Nathan, how's it going?
Hey guys, always a thrill to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you for being here. And I don't know what say you, Nathan? Why don't you lead us off?
Yeah, sure, James. So The New World is Terrence Malick's fourth film. Listeners who have been following along with our Malick series so far, and if they've happened to be watching the films with us, they'll be seeing this kind of interesting progression in how he's making his films. They start off from this very new Hollywood kind of more traditional way of filmmaking, certainly in terms of visual filmmaking. And maybe one of the things that really leaps out about The New World, just to kind of throw us into the deep end right away, is that it is an incredibly fluid experience. It's an incredibly flowing kind of film. I'm going to be using terms like that a lot. It's probably going to get tiring because this, to me, a film like The New World doesn't come around very often in that it registers for me with the same power that a great work of music registers. There's something ineffable. There's something indefinable about its power. And I know that's maybe not the best way to sort of start off because we're saying like, what the heck is it? Like we haven't even really talked about what it is.
No, I think it is a good way to start off because, originally we were wondering how this was going to sort of situate itself in our overview of Malick's body of work. And I had advocated at one time for us talking about this in conjunction with The Thin Red Line. But I'm so glad that we have reserved for this film its own episode, because upon returning to it, and especially after watching the different versions of this, I think there are three different versions of the film, and I watched the theatrical cut and then the extended cut. I just walked away from this feeling like, wow, this is like the sleeper, underrated hit of Malick's work. I remember I liked it so much more than I remember my first impression of it being. Mm-hmm. And I do think that this is a really special film. I don't know about you, Thomas.
Yeah. I mean, my first viewing a few years ago was the extended version. I remember liking it, but I wasn't coming back expecting as much of it, I guess, either. I'm going to go ahead and get into what it's about for the listener. We said came out in 2005, so that's 7 years after The Thin Red Line. The New World is, as you mentioned, Malick's take on the story of Pocahontas, and it stars a young 14-year-old actress as Pocahontas, Q'orianka Kilcher. I think she was actually 9 when she first met the colonists in history, but she's about 14 in this telling. And it stars Colin Farrell as John Smith and Christian Bale as her later eventual husband, John Rolfe. And it deals with Pocahontas' story, but also with the founding of Jamestown in 1607. It's set in Virginia. It's filmed in our home state of Virginia, but also in London at the very end. What I like about it is it's both kind of historically accurate, not without poetic license, but it's pretty historically accurate, and yet it's super romantic and poetic at the same time. So you're sort of getting the best of both worlds. It's not like this, to use the, I'm not even saying this to bash the Disney Pocahontas film, which I'm not really familiar with, but since you mentioned it, it's not really what you would call like a Disney approach exactly. But it's also not like this like totally gritty, like filthy, deconstruction of the myth or something like that. It's like having it both ways in a way that works, I think.
Right. Yeah. And one of the things that I think is apparent almost immediately is the sense of Malick's reverence for his source material, for the subject, both the people, and in particular Pocahontas, but also, John Smith and Rolfe, these other figures around her, the early colonists, but also the setting, the place, and the native peoples who were there. Everything just seems to be very lovingly treated, very seriously taken, and the beauty is just staggering. We've been talking about Malick as a beautiful filmmaker, and it's true. Whether you're talking about the amazing cinematography in Days of Heaven or the incredible use of music in The Thin Red Line, I think here it's almost like this just multi-sensory bombardment of all this like beauty coming at you from the voiceover and from the settings and the way that it's shot. Lubezki is the
this is his first collaboration with Emmanuel Lubezki, also known as Chivo, his cinematographer, and he works with him, Nathan, for how long? How many more movies after this?
Yeah, so this was their first collaboration, and then they shot The Tree of Life, To the Wonder, Night of Cups, and Song to Song. So they did...
Okay, so everything up to A Hidden Life, they worked together.
Hidden Life was the first project, they did not do together, but
right.
Hidden Life was, the cinematographer of Hidden Life was Jorg Vidmer. I may be mixing his name up, right. But he was working on The New World as well. So Jorg is... longtime Steadicam operator who worked with both Lubezki, and I guess he worked mostly with Lubezki. So in the sense that Hidden Life is a kind of continuation of the style that Malick developed with Lubezki, with a different, but with someone who was there and saw it all and was kind of there.
It's also worth mentioning, Colin Farrell was allowed to operate the camera at times and sort of improvise little things with
cool.
the lead actress.
Yeah, well, I was wondering about Lubezki, if this was his first time working with Malick, because as I mentioned in a previous episode, the first Malick film I saw was To the Wonder. Yeah. And so for me, this partnership between Malick and Lubezki has been kind of like the touchstone of my experience of Malick and my understanding his style. And so it was so exciting to see that, already so developed in this. We've been getting a sense of how Malick has been growing as a filmmaker in these films that we've been covering so far. So yeah, you'd think that they would have had to have a period of time where they together tried to find their footing, but already with this film, this partnership just seems to be so together and manifest in this very singular way. And I found that surprising,
Yeah, well, their approach was very thought out, and they had a lot of conversations where they developed what they called the Dogma about how they approach cinematography. I believe this was named after this like Scandinavian film, or I guess Danish film movement, Dogma 95. So it was kind of like a little tribute to that. I don't know that much about that movement, but they developed these rules for cinematography, and I'm hoping Nathan will be able to tell us more about the approach since we're discussing this now. But It included things like avoiding artificial lighting, avoiding filters, avoiding the use of dollies, avoiding CGI to a large extent, and avoiding, postcard-like aesthetics, things like that. So yeah, I want to pass it to you, Nathan, though, if you want to talk about what you consider to be like the hallmarks of this collaboration, particularly in this film.
Yeah, absolutely. So the reference to Dogma, just to put things a little bit in context, is Dogma 95 was a film movement or mini wave, you might say, that comes out of Denmark in the late 90s. So the two most famous filmmakers associated with that would be Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg. And the thing about Dogma 95 is that it was an attempt to kind of strip cinema basically down to the essentials. Like, you often see these kinds of reform movements pop up throughout history. There's this great desire to get rid of the industrial kind of, all the stuff that gets in the way of the real authentic experience, the real feeling, getting things, just trying to get to a deeper experience of reality. But the thing that sets Dogma 95 apart kind of more than anything else is that they embraced video, like consumer grade or the emerging video technology, of the time, which, is not, in terms of resolution, is not high. It's not high resolution. It's quite smeary. It's quite muddy. The colors, it's a very ugly format according to a traditional film standard of beauty. And so they embraced that to do these very kind of raw human dramas. And there's some things that are, praiseworthy maybe about what they were doing, but it was a movement that I think, because of its specificity in how it's going about trying to get to this sense of reality, it kind of burns out pretty fast, but there's some really interesting films, in that category. When we get to Malick and Lubezki, they're kind of taking that same desire to get to a deeper experience of reality, but they're doing it within the context of a more traditional film setting. So they're not getting rid of 35 millimeter film. They're not getting rid of film, the medium of film at all in favor of video. They're sticking with, kind of what they've already worked with. But they want to remove a lot of the industrial constraints. The things that, what it really comes down to is both Lubezki and Malick seem to have found each other at the moment when they were most ready to kind of just embrace this way of freedom in filmmaking. And this is what you see. You can sort of see Malick kind of moving towards this in just all the aspects of his filmmaking, not just in the shooting and in the visuals, but in how he edits and the way he uses voiceover. But with Lubezki is the first cinematographer he works with who is kind of just ready to rock, like in terms of whatever we feel is best, we're just going to run with it. It was a real meeting of the minds. It was a real meeting of these kind of two artistic hearts that were ready to rock and roll with a very free form kind of way of making films. And so what that ends up looking like during the New World, Thomas, I know you did a lot of research on the script.
Yeah, I read the screenplay a few days ago.
One of the most interesting things about the film is that there's this kind of astonishingly, from what I understand, astonishingly beautifully written screenplay, which they apparently shot every single line of dialogue in that film or in that screenplay, and then they kind of went and shot another film on top of that,
right?
Which is what ends up being the actual film that we see, and by that I mean the improvisation. And so this urge to break the constraints, like we're not going to have lights as much, they're only going to use lights if they absolutely have to. Everything's kind of motivated by necessity, and so if they're shooting out in a natural setting, natural light is the answer. And it's really fascinating to see in the film how they've developed ways to use the setting, use the sun as their only lighting source in very expressive ways. One example would be they would always try to shoot with the sun as the backlight. And then I guess they would bounce or try to fill in to get more light on people's faces. Traditionally, you would add in the old Hollywood model, you would add a light to try to like get someone to be the same brightness as the background. But here they're shooting with very bright backgrounds like the river and the sun and all that, and they don't have they're constrained by their dogma. They don't have these lights, but it produces this incredible creative response where they embrace the limitations and they run with it. And this is, I think we'll probably get into this later, but for me as a filmmaker, this is probably the most inspiring aspect of the film is you see an embrace of a voluntary embrace of restrictions that aren't just kind of arbitrarily decided upon. They really seem like they're geared towards trying to get into the heart of what this particular film is, and trying to get to a sense of experience that the film is trying to express.
Well, for example, the freer you are from lighting, the more free you are to improvise in camera movement and blocking and everything else. And so you see that a lot in, the Tree of Life, which we'll talk about next time, but also in the New World. And, when you listen to interviews with the actors, one of the things that they talk about is how they start to feel like the camera or the camera person is like in the scene with them as a performer, as opposed to like this static thing where you're feeling like sort of judged and watched by this thing that's just sitting there, a still camera or a choreographed camera. But there's this sort of dance-like thing that happens with the camera, and that creates a more spontaneous way of relating, for the actors and for the whole feel of the scene.
Right. And I also got to just say that even just in terms of the end result of the picture and the picture quality, I think that this far exceeds anything that I've seen in a long time. I don't know about you guys. I don't know what's happened, but it seems like every new movie I see now, I don't like the way movies look anymore. And I'm trying to focus this criticism that I have. I've mentioned it on the podcast before, but it's this feeling of everything being like too pretty, too sort of like taken care of and treated. And I don't know if industry standards have changed significantly. Obviously 2005, that's like 20 years ago, but it's just watching this movie felt like such a breath of fresh air because I thought, why can't movies be beautiful like this anymore? I was just seeing the trailer for Coppola's new film, and I just felt my heart sink because it just looked pretty in the way that all of these new movies look these days.
Smoothed over.
Yeah. And like the lighting's all very soft and like nicely thought out and it just feels plastic somehow. I tried to talk about this with the Scorsese film that we talked about, Killers of the Flower Moon. I think I might have brought it up with Rings of Power. It's just like, what happened? The movies looked so good.
Well, what's interesting is that this is true whether it's a super commercial product or more of an art house type product. It seems like there's just
even Wildcat. We recently watched Wildcat.
We're gonna review Wildcat next, but even the coloring. It's not necessarily that it looks realistic, but there's always something. Either it's too smoothed over and glossy, or like it's post-produced in such a way, in a stylized way that feels like it's sort of like suffocating the visuals a little bit, which is how I felt about it in Wildcat, which we'll talk about, which I liked, by the way. I don't want to give the wrong impression. I liked that movie.
Right. Cabrini is another example that comes to mind. Anytime something like approaches a certain level of excellence in terms of, or accepted excellence in terms of
competence
and production quality, nowadays it just seems so ugly to me, and I want, like, give me the original Lord of the Rings trilogy, give me Age of Innocence, give me the New World. Somehow these movies just seem to be cinema at its peak. Am I totally off base here, Nathan?
Not totally off base, and I think I agree with you for the most part. I think the thing that I'm trying to just nail down kind of what the aspect is that's kind of really leaping out at you. And I think one that for sure is that early 2000s. So you mentioned Lord of the Rings, like this ties in as well. Early 2000s is still that era when film production, digital cameras were not at the level that they could offer any kind of competition to the film, to celluloid as a capture medium. But that was coming up very soon, right? The New World comes out at the end of 2005. Apocalypto is, one of the early films shot on like the Genesis camera, and that starts to show kind of, the digital revolution is right around the corner with, red cameras about to drop and all that. So it's right on the cusp. It's interesting. The New World is right on the cusp at the beginning of this changeover. from exclusively celluloid productions to not exclusively digital, but primarily digital. And I think there is so one thing that leaps out to me is the feel of the film stock of that time. I believe this film was shot on Kodak. I don't know what the actual stock was. It was probably like Vision 2 or Vision 3. And anything that's shot in that, I think it might have been Vision 2 actually, which is kind of like that's a kind of stock that's like bridging the 90s, the late 90s into the early 2000s. And it is a beautiful stock. Like there's a real there's a softness to the image. The thing maybe that's worth understanding about film stock development is that at the same time that digital, technicians in companies like Red and Ari and all that, they're developing digital sensors that can capture with the same level of same or better level of detail than a film camera, than a film strip. The film companies, the ones making the stock like Kodak and Fuji, they are innovating, and they're innovating their stock as well, and they're trying to develop and it's a bit more of a, I don't know the whole process, but it is a more of a organic, more chemical kind of process. They're trying to create, a capture medium that is capturing more detail. Because if you compare like Kodak film stock of the early 2000s to like the 70s, obviously the 70s you see a much softer kind of look. It's not like, totally different, but there is a softer feel to it. And that becomes, of course, something that people enjoy about, new Hollywood movies, is that softness. So that's one thing that leaps out is the film stock at the time, even compared to the film stock of today. Like film stock is still being made. When I was learning film in the late 2000s, Kodak Vision 3 was the thing that we were kind of shooting on for our own films. And even there's like a difference in terms of the detail. It's not digital, but it's fine grained is maybe the way we put it. There's a fineness to it. There's a sharpness to it. And that's actually just kind of continued. I think you see this with the film stocks that have been, developed since then. There's a sharpness to it to the point where a film like J.J. Abrams is the first Star Wars sequel, The Force Awakens. That's a film that was very famously shot on film. It was a big deal because it was a big director saying, "No, I'm shooting on film. I'm going to be a traditionalist about this, and it's going to be a traditional like wonderful spectacle experience." And the final result, partly because there's heavy amounts of VFX in it, but really there's when I saw the film, I was like, I can't really tell if this was shot on film or on digital, because the emulation, you can emulate film really well nowadays with a digital image, and with film, it's gotten so fine that it's kind of hard to tell the difference. It's like gradations of difference that only really an expert cinematographer could really tell. So I think that's part of what you're dealing with, James, is like our experience of cinema, whether it's film or whether it's digital, has reached this kind of like collapsing point of like total detail. And then on top of that, we have all these tools that allow us, especially in color grading. Digital color grading allows you complete control over the image to try to tweak every single little aspect. Whereas traditional,
which is a big part of what we're responding to.
Yeah, and traditional color grading is not like, you don't have that much control. It was a guy basically like adding more red, adding more green, adding more blue. Like it's in the timing system, and so there's an art to that too, right? But it's much less fine. And
that's why it's interesting to see directors like Ryusuke Hamaguchi, who just totally embrace the fact that it's video. Like that it's digital, and it looks really digital, and it's disconcerting because you're like, this isn't how a movie is supposed to look. At least that was my experience for seeing Drive My Car. I was like, it's so crisp, it's so clean. Something about the way the motion looks is like, but it's not in the same way as like a super glossed over product. It's just that he's not trying to make digital look like film, and so there's like an honesty about it in that in that way, which is very interesting.
Interesting.
Well, you really see it come up. Just to maybe throw one more example out there, like it's interesting in films that are shot digitally, but they're still using kind of traditional filter. They're using filters. They're putting actual glass filters in front of the camera, which distorts the light and softens. They're doing things to soften the image, but they're working with a capture medium that isn't as soft as film stock. And it's really interesting because they may be using filters that have been used for decades on film products, where like they're taking the edge off of the sharpness of the digital image, and it creates kind of a whole different effect. Like we're kind of in an age when there's a lot of playing around with this, and I mean, as a filmmaker, it's exciting because you're discovering all these new little kind of nuances of beauty that you can do with an image, and the way that light and color is playing with all these combinations. But I think what you're describing, James, I think we're seeing the emergence of a new style or a new set of styles, kind of a new aesthetic, is still kind of finding its footing. And then on top of that, you mentioned Megalopolis as an example, and there's other, like a lot of these Disney Plus shows that are made with, they're made basically entirely in studio with what's called, the volume, like the LED screen stage. Right. There's new ways of kind of trying to make stuff that traditionally would have been you go out on location and deal with all the stuff that comes with that. And so we are in this era where there's a very plastic feel to a lot of films that are being made much more on stages than they would have been 20 years ago, when they would have been made on location in whether that's a city or whether that's out in the wilderness.
Yeah.
That's part of it. We're seeing it's a really, I think it boils down to, we have more control over the moving image than we ever have. Yeah. But, are we happy is kind of the question.
Well, right, exactly. And that's what motivates, I think, responses like these Dogma rules for cinematography. Artists want to invite the constraints, but like you said, not in an arbitrary way, but in a way that's going to help sort of focus the work and get to the heart of what it is that they're after. And one thing that I'll say about the New World is that its sense of place is so strong. I already mentioned this sort of like reverence that you get the sense of Malick having in approaching this place. And I don't know where the film was shot, but
Virginia.
Okay, well there you go. Like it's like so Virginia.
The coast of Virginia.
Yeah, but there's so much varied experiences of place that Malick is able to sort of extract out of that. Yeah. So whether we're in the Indian villages, in their sort of huts or whatever, or whether we're back at, Jamestown and in the fort and in the cramped sort of dirty spaces there, or we're out in the meadows and the fields. There's so many scenes shot, amid tall grass, and yet everyone feels different from the other, tonally, and it's not just a matter of the time of day, but it's like it's like exploring all of these different rooms inside of a large mansion, whether we're in wooded areas, in swamp, by the river, and so there's this great sense of place, and it's one of the things that carries you along, I think, through the film that especially in the extended cut. I'll say the extended cut, frankly, felt shorter for me than the theatrical cut. In a lot of ways, I felt like more restless watching the theatrical cut than I did during the extended. And part of it is that the extended, you really get this feeling of this like multi-course meal, where you're moving from one chapter into the next, right, and one sort of feeling into the next, and you're really able to sort of drink it all in. And it's very, very satisfying on even just sort of a purely aesthetic level, to say nothing of the story, which, we'll get into talking about this John Smith Pocahontas love story. But I mean,
for a movie about exploring a new world, or really multiple new worlds, and interior and exterior senses, like, that's very important that he gives you the sense of this like boundless variety of this new country, and even just Virginia, because that's all you see of the New World is Virginia, and then a little bit of a tiny little patch of Newfoundland in that one scene.
And there's one, before we sort of talk about the themes and the story here, I think it's also worth mentioning the music, because now who did the music on this one?
Well, James Horner, but there's a lot of classical music.
Right.
So James Horner famously was very mad at Malick for displacing a lot of his music and using classical music instead. But there's still quite a bit of James Horner in it.
Okay, I see. Yeah. But there are a lot of recurrent themes that are used at different key moments that are sort of tying together these different images with some overarching themes. And I just is this the first one that uses classical music as extensively as it does? I think with the exception of, I think there's quite a bit in the first movie in Badlands, but it's all kind of from one composer. I see.
He's not like putting in like piano pieces and different things that are like, it doesn't feel as like sometimes maybe surprising as some of the uses of classical music in like a Native American setting or something like that.
Yeah. But I mean, take just for instance the very first opening shots of the boats arriving to Virginia for the first time, and the swelling music that's going on through that whole sequence as the Indian tribes are seeing these boats approaching, and
the overture to Das Rheingold.
Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness!
Which also is used in the mountain climbing sequence in Werner Herzog's Nosferatu. That's my first experience of that piece in a movie.
Oh,
so
cool.
For me, it's the Nosferatu climbing to Dracula's castle.
Well, and that piece gets reused 2 or 3 times.
3 or 4 times.
Yeah, 3 or 4 times. Yeah. So it's three times. It's really
it's very much a structural, like it's not quite. It's like definitely at the beginning and it's definitely at the end, but it's not quite in the middle. But it's like. It's definitely a structural marker of like...
It feels like you're getting to another like significant moment of...
transition, we might say.
Or...
Revelation. Yeah. It's like something changes, it's heralding in.
It feels like
this
it's like resetting something or something whenever it comes.
Yeah, because it's such an extraordinary piece, and the way that it never quite resolves. I mean, it does when they play it. Malick uses it at the very end to end the film, and he lets it finally resolve. I don't think he quite lets it resolve in the other times he uses it.
I see.
But there's this searching, and again, it's an overture. It's the beginning. It's the taste, and it's so appropriate for a film about the New World. That it's got this tentative quality to it.
Exactly. And this newness is something that all of the characters are after in different ways. And so ostensibly this is a film about the New World, about, the sort of European discovery of America and the first contact with the Native Americans there. And but it's also about this new world that maybe lies beyond our earthly shores. And I what I think is so remarkable about this film is that Malick takes this subject and simultaneously gives it a rigorous historical, Hollywood treatment even. I mean, it's a good movie. It's a good period piece about its subject, while also deftly using it as a vehicle to explore the themes that matter most to him and that have been recurring, in the films that we've been talking about, but are coming more sharply into focus here and are going to be sort of the thing that he's stuck on for many more films to come, Right. But I think you see a really straight through line between this and the Tree of Life, This might as well be called the Tree of Life New World Edition. You know what I mean? Like it's grappling with so many of the same things, and it kind of ends up in the same place, strangely.
Yeah, James, what you just said about the New World is like the Tree of Life. Like, I mean, I disagree in the sense that I think what it's about. Yes, there are the recurring themes that make Malick so Malicky. Are definitely, there's a through line there. On the other hand, the films that he makes after the New World, go on an entirely different tangent with, they become he makes his autobiographical cycle, you could say, like the Tree of Life, and then the films that come after. It's interesting that he gets on these kind of like 3 or 4 film kind of kicks almost, where he, the overall overarching themes are all present, but the specific kind of content is very specific to that period of his life. Now, the area though where the New World is absolutely like 100% more of, we could say, mature Malick or modern Malick. The New World is 100% the emergence of Malick, the Malick that we all know and love, of this fluid, mobile kind of vision of reality, and then and a lot of that, of course, maybe the most important part of that, certainly visually, is the contribution of Lubezki and Jörg Widmer, and because they're the ones who are actually operating the cameras. They're the ones that creates this incredible consistency from the New World through to to A Hidden Life. And so, yeah, on a formal level, I absolutely agree that this marks the beginning of modern Malick, and it seems as though he's settled onto the way of expressing a cinematic reality that he's content with, or that the search continued. He found the right path. I think a lot of the films, the films he made before the New World are all incredible. I was tweeting about this yesterday. To me, those are not masterpieces in the sense that they come together completely, as these kind of incredibly integrated, integral objects. But they are the work of a master. They're obviously the work of a great talent, a great filmmaker finding his way with what he's working with. And the New World is the first one where I think it's kind of all there. Like, it's just all together, and then he runs with that into the Tree of Life. So I agree with you and I don't agree with you, but I more agree with you than I don't agree with you.
Well, I think that one of the reasons why I describe it that way is because it's so much a film about the sort of interiority of its characters. And, I think you can make a case for how this film is about, the different characters, seeing them, like, who's the protagonist of this film, But I think ultimately it really has got to be Pocahontas, because we open with her voiceover, and then we close with her. If it's not her voiceover, it's sort of her physical etude, and it's so much this. It's trying to describe this interior experience of search and discovery and disappointment and disillusionment and pain, and we get a lot of that in earlier Malick, but somehow this is coming to the fore. It's asserting itself in a much stronger register than it has in the past films, even with The Thin Red Line. And I think that it's aided by this like flowing part that you're describing, but also by this fragmented quality that it has, where there's this things don't fit together neatly into, well, I don't mean to be sounding like I'm directly contradicting what you said, because what I'm trying to describe is our experience of character, where sequences unfold in a way that doesn't seem to sort of necessarily cohere in a logical way, in sort of like chronological or like a narrative logic, but it's kind of like a psychological or a spiritual.
Tell me if this is an example of what you're talking about. So I think this is when Smith he's just been decided that he's been captured by the Indians. They're going to kill him, and then they decide not to because of Pocahontas' intercession. And then they are doing this kind of like ceremony where they, I guess, I don't know if it's symbolically bringing back to life or making him part of that, not making him part of the tribe per se, but basically you suddenly cuts to like a ship's sails filling with wind.
Yes. But there's the sort of thing you're talking about. No, that's not the moment I'm thinking about, but there's so many moments like this, For instance, there's the moment when Smith first returns back to Jamestown after his mission to the Indians, and this is a little bit later. This is when he's sort of deposed by his deputy, and they start to get into this sort of confrontation. But the editing sort of jumps around chronologically, where it's almost like we see the come to blows before it actually gets there. Smith says something like, come at me, then I'll know I'll live for 1,000 years or something. But it's not. But then when it cuts back, we're not there yet. It's still bubbling up. So there's all sorts of little experiences like this where...
Right, sometimes you'll have a character talking, and then like it'll be hit two different sentences that he's saying interrupted with each other. Like in that exact moment, I think that happens.
So it's this kind of collaging of elements, both visually and orally, with the voiceover and stuff. Sometimes elements that have nothing to do with the scene at hand, will flash suddenly to sort of an Indian witch doctor or something like that, and it's this vibe that's being captured, and it's a kind of alchemy, and that certainly relates to the editing and the way that the editing is handled, very singularly here. But it's a part of what I'm trying to trying to pinpoint in my comparison to Tree of Life or to his later works, is like how he's collaging these elements and even taking the story itself and using it as a vehicle to sort of document cinematically this human interior drama.
Well, I think there's a very distinctive way in which the editing works, like even aside from juxtaposing images, like from one scene with another or something like that, there's like a way that it works as it can't really be separated from the camera movement per se, because it like works as a form of camera movement in a way. I mean, of course, this is always the case in editing, right? Within a scene where you're changing angles and stuff like that. But what I mean is there are like these little micro jumps that happen where, like, say a character is saying dialogue and he's agitated, and so instead of like waiting for him to say the next line, it'll just like jump cut, like as soon as he finishes this phrase, he'll start the next phrase. It's like this. So I think that I believe that happens when Wingfield or something like that is saying why he thinks that Smith shouldn't be chosen to lead the expedition up the river, for instance. So there's these what are called like jump cuts the you'll cut. It's the same scene. It's even the same angle essentially, but like you're suddenly just a slight shift in perspective or a slight shift in time,
right?
That happens, and that happens a lot in the Tree of Life as well. So I think that is something that I'm not saying there wasn't any of that in Thin Red Line, but I think that this comes in a more distinctive way when the collaboration with Chivo happens. I know that he didn't edit the film, but there seems to be something of a piece with this whole visual style. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, it's absolutely, you're absolutely right. And I think the thing that it represents is, like, I was referring to the New World as like modern Malick, and like what we're talking about with, classical filmmaking, right? A classical sense of space, a classical sense of time, continuity. Really what we're getting at is like Malick is disrupting continuity. In the Criterion set, there's an essay by Tom Gunning, film historian, which gets into this. It's worth reading if you have access to it. But basically, classical filmmaking is very concerned about space and the time, right? And it's like what's happening when, make sure that we're fully oriented, we know exactly what's happening where. And then, of course, when you get into the more modern kind of film movements, like you mentioned the jump cut, Thomas, like the French New Wave is an example of seeing this in action, where it's actually, it's fragmenting time. But Malick is doing something even further than that, I think, in the New World, where he's not just like a traditional jump cut is kind of like the same take often, but you're just you're just jumping ahead, but there's still a sense of continuity. There's moments in the New World where Malick jump cuts to an entirely different take, and it's an entirely different take because the framing, the angle is completely off, but the dialogue is the same, and it's
sometimes costumes are different.
Yeah,
I noticed.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
wow.
yeah. And not many times, but there's like one or two times where I noticed the costume was different. This is a different time.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because what we have here is a contradiction in like the filmmaking approach, because Malick on the one hand is this like uber he's very careful about the detail of the setting and creating like a physical filmmaking production that is very faithful to the details and the historical details. And so you think that a filmmaker doing that would be very, very concerned that we would be able to be fully oriented and always kind of like experiencing that. A recent example of this, we might compare it to, I haven't actually seen this film, but from the images that I have seen, I'm pretty sure it's in this area, the Northman. You can see like in some of the way that they handle like the villages and the physical production, it's like they're long takes, these kind of like long takes moving around showing what's happening. They're very concerned about like, we put a lot into this and we want to make sure that you see every angle, everything, right? And I love that Malick is putting that level of detail into the physical production, but then he's not constrained by that, you know? And so we have there's a very like traditional kind of classic sense there of get it right. And then he there's a very modern, intuitive, really the word we're looking for is intuitive. And this is, probably why I love Malick so much is like, he is a filmmaker who is embracing the intuitive. He's not going to be constrained by, sort of these other rules that come into play. He's always going to be chasing the intuitive sense of, okay, what's next? What do we do? So, if we have a going that is a totally different take, but it intercuts with this, what this character is saying, and it feels right, we're going to use it, and we'll trust that an audience can kind of, go with it. There's a profound faith in, like, I probably don't. I don't have the words to kind of like fully expound my feelings on this, but there's an incredible faith kind of in the moving image as this thing that can capture reality. But at the same time, there's this incredible awareness of its like, its limitations, I guess you could say. This awareness that what we're dealing with here, like we're dealing with a medium, we're dealing with a made thing, and that's okay. We're not trying to do the classic Hollywood, the traditional Hollywood spectacle thing. It's almost like they're trying to replace reality. Why do we love Star Wars? Lots of reasons, but one of the reasons we love it is because, or at least this is the way that Star Wars is often sold to audiences, is it lets you escape. It lets you enter this other world, And so I think Malick is disrupting those kinds of models of like sharing, of giving a film to an audience where, we're rooted. We want to stay rooted. Like we want to be in this world that he's creating, but also not kind of lose touch with our own, I think he's fully dialed into that, and all of the things that he's doing in this film and in his later films is really expressing that, it's disrupting that, that
there's something, I wonder to what extent he's familiar with Brecht, because Brecht and like Brechtian theater, models are sort of, characterized by this concept of alienation, where the actors try to, alienate the audience by basically doing something to kind of disrupt, this is my understanding of Brecht, disrupt the illusion, disrupt the fantasy, disrupt the extent to which you are passively receiving what you're experiencing, and to sort of create a space to have the audience awakened to their intellectual engagement with the play. And in a way, I see Malick doing that here. In these moments of disrupting continuity or doing something unexpected, sometimes the effect is to actually kind of highlight the cinematic quality of it, the fact that I'm watching a movie, but it engages my intellect in a way that maybe just getting caught up in the story and in the images and the seamless editing, the invisible editing, a way that can't achieve necessarily.
Right.
Like there's I think that's a great comparison point. Maybe the thing that Malick, I think, does that Brecht's or the Brechtian theory doesn't address, like Malick is ultimately about the heart. Like he really is, he's not just trying to get you to intellectually engage. I think the films would come off a lot more dry and stale. He seems really concerned with, at least in my view, and others can differ, but I really think he's trying to engage the heart in a way that of course involves the use of the mind, like he's kind of hitting all the points of like the soul really. But I'm, again, I haven't studied Brecht in a long time, so I could be wrong with this, but my sense of Brecht is that it's a much more intellectually and then obviously politically. Yes. It's in the realm of ideas. It's about ideas, and coming back to the. But
this is contemplative. This is contemplative in a way that the ideas are used to try to get to the heart, and I'm trying to sort of identify here what might be a key difference between a Malickian and a Brechtian mode. And I don't know. Would you think it would be that in Malick's kind of disrupting expectations or continuity or subverting things, he's never fully pulling the rug out from under you and never fully like dispelling the I don't know. What do you think might be a key difference there?
What I would say is, that Malick is fulfilling what Brecht intended in that, but Brecht could not actually fulfill, because from my understanding, he wasn't a man of faith. Like, he wasn't a Christian, and he, his I don't know what his metaphysics were or whatever, but anyway, we know it was a very, like, the thing about, like, from what I said, the Brechtian shock is to pull you out of the addled state that, the capitalist society has put you into, right, basically, so that you can start to see the reality behind it that's been hidden from you by, by that. I think Malick is taking that same impulse and even addressing maybe the aspects of truth that Brecht was trying to work with. But Malick is, he's grounded, I think, in a Christian sense of reality, and so he, it comes back down to the goodness, like the sacramental quality of the world. That's how I read it.
I love that the last shot of this film is just the trees and, like, the silence, the wind, the birds. And it's there's so much faith there.
Yeah, well, Nathan, when you were at this, maybe pulls together things you were both saying. Nathan, when you were talking about how he has this confidence in the moving image, but also is aware of its limitations, and you were talking about how it's contemplative, what occurred to me is, like, Malick does not have this, like, magisterial approach to his work. Like, he's not, it doesn't feel like I'm the master of these images. Like, it's the opposite of, like, what is stereotypically said of, like, a Kubrick or something like that. Like, the way that he shots, the fragmented nature of it, like, plays into that. You know what I mean?
There's a humility. It's not like
this majestic crane shot. I mean, not that there aren't, big sweeping shots, but, like, it's sort of entering, rather than, like, containing what it shows you, it, like, enters into it.
Yeah.
So the camera being a performer in the scene, as the actors have described it, like, that works that way as well. And it's true of his relationship with his material, but it's also true of his relationship with the audience. So I think, Nathan, one of you said last time when we talked about the Thin Red Line that he leaves a lot of freedom of interpretation for the audience. And I think that, I think that he's neither dominating the material nor is he dominating the audience. And there may be a kind of mastery or a kind of craftsmanship that is there. Obviously there is, but it feels like he is standing within it rather than, like, standing above it all, and so I think that's, like, a key part of his style that emerges more and more over time. And I haven't even seen the trilogy after the Tree of Life, but I'm assuming that it's much like that, in this respect. So I think, and one reason I wanted to say this is, first of all, that's part of how contemplation is for a creature, right? But also, I think we've just spent the past hour talking about the visual style and the form for the most part. And I think this is why it's important to talk about this on a Catholic podcast, is because, like, the style and the technical approach that you take informs the vision of reality that you have. And that's not to say that a traditional narrative Hollywood style of editing and shooting cannot have a Catholic vision of reality or something like that. But people might, typically in Catholic commentary on books or films, the focus is almost entirely on the plot and on the themes. But I think Malick is a particularly clear example where you simply couldn't get where he's going without his approach to style. You know what I mean? Like, style and substance are very closely connected and really kind of inseparable.
And you probably don't get his approach to style without the kind of humility and the disposition that a Christian filmmaker can potentially bring to a work.
Yeah, and so I mean, I just wanted to put a point on that. It's like, this is why it's not just interesting to talk about his style, like, as this separate object of, like, aesthetic appreciation, which might be the case with some movies and it would still perhaps be worth talking about. But I think that, like, this is case in point for this is why Catholics need to think about these things. This is why Catholic artists can't just, like, blindly or, like, automatically you can follow prevailing forms if you want to, but you can't just follow them like as a matter of course and without thinking about whether it's appropriate to your subject material and what it's conveying about reality. Because like, again, what you end up doing, you may end up like suffocating the truth that you have to offer with like a wineskin
right
that is like not appropriate.
Right. And if you look at the way that this film was made, you know, it probably did have to eschew a lot of wineskins along the way, you know. So you talked about the screenplay that had to be written.
Yeah.
You know, maybe the project only gets greenlit because that screenplay gets written. You know, we talked about there's different cuts, you know, and the theatrical cut really, I think it really, the film really suffers from what is left on the cutting room floor, you know.
What really leaps out is the sense of receptivity. Like there's Malick his mastery is that he is a more receptive filmmaker than I think I would say probably than any other filmmaker working today, and maybe ever, honestly. I mean, which is interesting because it presents certain problems if you want to train other filmmakers to be like Malick, you know, which is obviously like has plenty of thorns to that idea. That's not even necessarily a good idea. But if we want to say, okay, what's worth taking away from him for building up a culture of cinema, we really have to kind of get away from the idea that, you know, the style that these things that we're talking about, the especially in the New World and onwards, there's a very recognizable visual style that we associate with Malick. But the question maybe isn't, I think we need to be asking, you know, more and more, what is it about this that is touching reality? What about this, you know, that is, it's not just unique to him. It's unique to him because he's the only one who's really kind of going all the way into it, you know. But now anybody who tries to kind of pick up his tools and do it in a similar way is branded as Malickian. I think 100 years from now, that won't be the case. You know, it'll be a much more kind of like school of filmmaking in the same sense that maybe, you know, the medieval artists like Giotto or Fra Angelico or something like that. Yeah, they're recognizably them, but there's also this whole kind of like other plethora of artists who are making in similar styles. All of that is to say that there is such the gift that he gives to us in kind of being an example here is, this receptivity and this lack of attachment. And this is where I think, you know, if we were to pursue this line of thought even further down into the spiritual realm and the question of like, how does spirituality relate to creativity and to making, you know, we could probably talk a lot about that, but there's a fascinating lack of attachment that he has. He wrote a beautiful script. Malick is a master of writing dialogue. Like this is the thing that blows my mind. He is an incredible writer. And I hope we get to talk about the line that you know, at the very end of the film, there's one of my favorite line exchanges in all of cinema is in this film. But he's an incredible writer of dialogue, and he's not afraid to just lose it, you know? And it's amazing when you watch the supplements and you see the various makings ofs and read people's comments who worked in the film, and you see this theme from various levels, from the editors, from producers and other collaborators, where they're kind of like, there's always this moment of befuddlement where they're like, well, we had this like great script and we like, it's almost like we didn't even use it, you know? We had this great dialogue, great moments, and it didn't end up in the cut. And it's like,
but it is used,
right?
Yeah,
but
so
it is.
I read the whole screenplay.
He's not attached.
Yeah.
I think there's a profound lesson there. He's not attached.
But it's a masterful recognition of what purpose it's able to serve.
Yeah,
you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I read the screenplay the other day, and I mean, I was struck by both how much he cut out and how much the bones are actually present. Like when you think about, when we talk about Malick improvising, it's easy to think like, well, the plot is improvised. Well, no, actually the whole structure of the story in the screenplay is there. Like all the major moments are basically there.
Yeah.
In the film.
Right.
But there's a lot more dialogue from Pocahontas. There's a lot more like straightforward back and forth dialogue from John Smith. There's also a lot more just like, you know, monologue in the sense of like John Smith giving a speech to people or, you know, whatever, things like that.
Yes.
But also, you know, what strikes me is that how much things are stripped down. So I just want to give two little examples. And what I think happens is it's the script for Malick to some extent. It is the backbone of things, and it's how you decide a lot of what you're going to shoot, and then you figure out maybe how to use it in a different way later. But it also, to me, has some kinship to the background work that an actor does, in that it's all going in, but it's not necessarily said explicitly.
Right.
So Malick is bringing out his themes more explicitly, much more explicitly in the screenplay, both in the narration and in the writing, in the dialogue. But there's also a sense in which he strips it down. He leaves it a lot more open to interpretation, things like that. And two good examples of that are Pocahontas is constantly talking to her mother in the voiceover of the film. She's like asking questions, even what seems to be prayers. And if you watch either of the cuts of the movie that I watched, the theatrical or the extended, it's very easy to watch that and think that she's simply talking to Mother Earth, right? But in the script, it's very clear she's talking to her actual deceased mother, who to her lives up in the sky, and she's looking for her guidance. So in the final film, it's more ambiguous, and you might not know at all. I think there's some shots that are in the extended version that are probably of her actual human mother. But that's one example. Another example of how things get trimmed down in a more plot sense is there's this scene. Do you remember the scene in the extended version where she goes into the woods and then she picks up a mushroom and looks at it, and then some sunlight shines? This is when she's devastated after hearing that John Smith has died.
Wow.
She picks up a mushroom and looks at it, and some sunlight shines.
That whole sequence afterwards is amazing. When she's wandering around the town.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. So basically, she picks up the mushroom. Sun shines on her. She puts it down, and then right after that, you get the character, the crazy Indian character, and her friendship with him. In the screenplay, she makes a suicide attempt. It's a poisonous mushroom. She eats the mushroom. She lays down on the forest floor. And then that crazy Indian character finds her there and gives her the antidote.
Wow.
So in this, it's not even that it's just implied that she commits suicide. It's clearly she doesn't try to commit suicide at all. You just see her consider it, and then the sun shines on her, and she puts the mushroom down. And then later you see her hanging out with the crazy Indian guy in the town. But there's no way to really know watching it that she's considering suicide in that moment unless you had read the screenplay.
Yeah.
So it's interesting just how stripped down that can be.
Well, if I can say, to me it just seems to be that Malick really recognizes that he is a filmmaker, and a film is not made at the typewriter, that the temptation might be to think that, okay, I'm going to just write this screenplay and then I'm going to have it. I've got but just as a sculptor, maybe does his preliminary sketches and studies his models or whatever. But when he gets in there with his marble or his clay or whatever, well, now it becomes an interaction between him and his medium, and, I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of theater, because lately I've found myself in the director's chair for theater. And it's when thinking about design, I've been designing my own sets, and it's so tempting to want to just come up with something on paper and then implement it. But what you actually need to come up with is something that can breathe, that can kind of be a container for you to then bring into the rehearsals with the actors, and then begin the dance of trying to shape and work and see what it ought to be.
Right. And the difficulty with Malick is that he's not only stripping his own work down, he's just stripping other people's work down. And they respond to that in various ways. So Christopher Plummer, there's a funny interview with him where he talks about how he would never work with him again because his most dramatic moments were reduced to background dialogue.
Wow.
And then James Horner, the composer who had done Titanic, right? He was very angry and publicly spoke against Malick and said that he didn't know how to use music, which is crazy. And then in the Criterion Extras, the editors really take him to task for that, because they're no, Malick, composers are intimidated to work with Malick because he knows more about music than almost any film director.
Wow.
But basically, James Horner said this could have been another Titanic, and it's just like a total mess because of Malick didn't know how to use music.
Wow. Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned Christopher Plummer. Like, that's such a great example because he is such a great presence in this film.
Yes.
You know, when you were listing off the people that this film stars, you know, and mentioned Colin Farrell and Christian Bale, I almost wanted to say, like, and Christopher Plummer.
Right.
But even though he's there just for a fraction of the time, he really brings this presence and this fatherly sort of authoritarian.
He's the one who most clearly represents England.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, he's got the authority. He brings the king's will. But he also talks about these early and I
aspirations,
guess
these ideals.
It almost feels anachronistic. I don't think it is. It's probably in those people's writings and stuff. But like, they're already talking about we're going to start a new way of life here.
Yeah,
and things
for sure,
like that.
for sure.
Yeah.
And that newness, that new way of life, is so much what this film is about.
Yeah.
And different characters' ability to reach out for that. And either be thwarted, you know, by themselves or not, you know. And I think that you know, perhaps the most sort of dramatic and obvious example is in John Smith, who, you know, at the beginning of the film arrives in chains. Okay, he's clearly made some sort of mutinous remarks or something, and it made me think about the beginning of certain RPG you know, fantasy games where you arrive, like, you know, you know, as the prisoner, and then you rise up, you know, because of course he ends up being the captain and kind of the president of Jamestown. But you see his sort of inner monologue shift throughout the film, where he begins, you know, saying, sort of repeating. It's almost like you can hear Christopher Plummer's character echoed in him, where he's talking about, you know, here, you know, there'll be enough for everyone, and it'll only cost your labor, you know, and there'll be no landlords to you know, oppress us with high rents, and you know. There's this idealism that also continues into his encounter with the Indians and with Pocahontas, you know, where he's kind of really impressed by this culture and their, you know, maybe there's a certain naivete, but he says things like, you know, they don't have any jealousy, there's no sense of property, words like forgiveness that don't exist in their vocabulary, and then with Pocahontas, you know, he's asking himself all these questions about love and who he is. He says, "I'm a free man now," and so there's this sense of him not just leaving behind an old world, but leaving behind an old self. You know, putting off the old man.
Yeah, I mean, at one point he says, like, trade this false life for a real one.
Yes, that's a
give
recurring
up the name of Smith or something like that.
Yeah, there's a recurrent theme of is this a dream or is this reality, and that he returns to that throughout. Of course, later, when he's back at Jamestown and he's given this responsibility of being the president of the colony, you know, his tune begins to change, and he starts to, there's all this conflict and doubt about what his intentions are with Pocahontas and how life can go on with her. And, you know, he begins, even when he sees her again, his interactions with her change to, you know, you don't know who I am, don't trust me, you know, and so there's this backsliding that ultimately ends up in a kind of listlessness, you know, and he literally wanders, you know, to Newfoundland, you know, not finding what he's looking for, and at the end of the film, when he is reunited with Pocahontas, says something, you know, she says, well, is this the line exchange that we're referring to?
Yeah.
Why does she say?
Pocahontas, well, so she's, you know, in the intervening times, she thought he died. He lied to her, you know, he left her to go take on a new sailing expedition. He told someone else to basically lie to her after 2 months, say that I drowned in the crossing. So that happens. She thinks he's dead. She marries John Rolfe. She sort of has this new life. She has a family, you know, she has a child. And then she and John Rolfe go back to England. And there, you know, she learns that John Smith is still alive, and it creates this conflict in the marriage of like, she sees herself as actually married to John Smith, because it turns out he's not dead. And so they have this reunion, this encounter, to kind of decide where things are once and for all. And she asks him this line, she asks him this question. She says, "Did you find your Indies, John?" and his answer, and this is why I say I think Malick is one of the great writers of dialogue, and he doesn't even flex it, except in moments like this. And Farrell plays this moment perfectly. He just looks at her, with that haunted look, and he says, "I may have sailed past them." And it's a very simple exchange. And even on paper, it's like, okay, well, yeah, I get the meaning, and it's like, this is too late, whatever. Maybe it's not, but in the moment, like, I don't know. I remember the first time I saw it. It was the first time I saw the extended cut, and it was my second time seeing the film. But my memory of the first seeing the theatrical cut, I have all I remember is just, I was bored out of my mind. It was like when it came out, and and I never really gave it two thoughts after that. But when I saw the extended cut in like 2009 when it came out, and I watched it on like a laptop, and I was like, I think I was sick, so I was just like, I had time to kill. And it was just this absolute revelation that was the moment I fell in love with Malick, actually, was seeing the extended cut of this for the first time.
Wow.
But that line just hit like a ton of bricks. And it to me, it's just extraordinary that he can do this fluid, immersive, naturalist cinema thing, and then bring it back to something as simple and classical as the poetry of dialogue.
Yes.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's the line. I don't know if sorry.
That's also the line where I felt like, okay, her marriage to John Rolfe is safe.
Yes.
Yes.
Even
the way she asked him, "Did you find your Indies, John? You shall." It's kind of like,
yeah,
good luck.
Yeah, well, no, but she and it's nice that she says "you shall." There's like a real confidence she gives him, like this parting gift.
There's a real
this parting encouragement.
Yeah. Yeah. So John Smith is an explorer. He's lived a lot of life, He's gotten into trouble. He even refers to himself in the extended cut as having been a pirate.
Yeah.
In the past.
He's got sailor's tattoos.
Yeah, he's got his mercenary earring.
And so there's so many different levels. He's like wanting to explore further. He's wanting to find the Indies. He's wanting to find the passage to the other sea. He's wanting to explore this new world. He's wanting to, Pocahontas is a new world to him, and the whole way of life that she represents. And the interior journey into himself and like who he really is as well. But all of these things are being sort of like, they're both symbolic of each other, but also like partially like in tension with each other. And so there's this great line. One of my other favorite sort of symbolic lines of the film is when Captain Newport, played by Christopher Plummer, says, what does he say? I wrote it down. He says he's trying to get him to go up and look for the passage in the north. And he says, "Shall you be a discoverer of passages which you refuse to explore beyond the threshold?" Meaning, like, you've discovered the threshold of the passage, so are you gonna not be the one to explore it as well? But that obviously applies to his relationship with Pocahontas just as much. And his whole like thing in the film and his inability to go there. Right. So he's like just gonna look for the geographical passage instead.
Well, what it is, to me, it's a parable about conversion and about this putting off the old man and taking on the new. And it seems to me like the insight here is that conversion is always a response to the inbreaking of love. There's this very evocative line that he has where he says, shall we not take love when it is given? You can glean some imperfection in that too, because he is very selfish in a lot of key respects. So even in the way that he describes that, like that taking, but there's an awareness that something has broken through into his life and that he's encountering a newness. And these lines like, "I'm a free man now," or lines like, "The fort is not the world, go into the wild, start over." There's this moment of decision that he's arrived at where he can either, choose this new path or go back. And the drama is taking place inside of him, and it's also around who he sees himself to be. So when he starts to sort of backslide and he says, "Yeah, you don't know me," Pocahontas, she in a sense has a clearer vision of him than he does of himself, because she sees him as he is, not encumbered by his past, So she's able to look at him and say, "You have no evil in you," or something along those lines. And we don't necessarily think of her as this poor, naive Indian girl. We I think buy it when she says that, but he does not. And that's the key, is that he becomes kind of invincible to her love, because he's unwilling to let go of this self-loathing, really, and that's like a key dynamic in like the way that love calls us forth. And I don't wonder if, what we see emerge here, well, we've seen love triangles in Malick's films already, obviously in Days of Heaven, but also in a sense in The Thin Red Line, with that character whose wife leaves him, but we see that emerge, in a very central way again here, with Rolfe. And I wonder if there isn't an attempt, almost like a triangulation, like when there's an earthquake and you triangulate the epicenter of the earthquake. When you have these three sort of poles of a love triangle, you try to sort of glean what is the sort of unifying phenomenon, like what's going on. I wonder if there isn't an attempt by Malick to try to illustrate or to glean the operations of love as it is, separate from its, not totally separate, but distinct from its experience between two people alone, Mm-hmm. But I'm on a bit of a digression here. My whole point is that this drama of conversion and this response to love in an existential sense, in like the very attitude of how I'm going to look at myself and am I going to let love change me? That's like very clearly on display in John Smith. And then again, too, in Pocahontas, perhaps even more importantly, because she's experiencing a new world as well.
Yeah, I think one of the big strengths of the extended cut is that it gives you a lot more of her internal conflict, as opposed to being this simple and like totally vulnerable character. Mm-hmm. You get a lot more sense of her, like her moral struggle, mm-hmm. Between loyalty to her people, loyalty to John Smith, and then later between loyalty to Rolfe and loyalty to John Smith. At first she seems to represent this like absolute openness and vulnerability, and so she enters into this like very passionate relationship with John Smith, and that's why she thinks that they were effectively married. Whether they consummated that relationship completely or not, I don't know. It's certainly like within the realm of possibility that they did, but she has this sense that she's already given her heart to him, and to her that's as good as being married, but it becomes complicated when even before the whole situation where she ends up in a way betraying her people by warning the Jamestown settlers that they're going to be attacked. She's saying things like that, especially in the extended cut. She's saying things like, I can't remember a specific line, but she's asking whether she can be true. She's asking. It's surprising in a way to watch that in the extended cut because we already know John Smith is confused about his own intentions, but she's also concerned about knowing herself and knowing her own heart, and doing the right thing. Yeah. And that comes out more strongly in the extended version. So we get this situation where she wants to be able to just like go. She wants to take love when it's offered. She wants to be able to go where it leads, but she has this simultaneous problem of like conflicting loves and the fact that the guy that she wants to be given to is not able to go there fully himself.
And she's also continually connecting this experience to a broader search, and that's sort of referenced in her appeals to her mother. And talking about the river that never runs dry and things like that. There's a kind of religious searching that's alluded to in all of this as well.
Right.
And I think is made kind of most explicit at the end, where she ends up, because where she ends up is dead. The film ends with her passing. But we get this amazing, beautiful sequence of her dancing, sort of she's spiraling, she's going into the water in her sort of
her English dress,
Elizabethan garb or whatever. It's this amazing combination of elements, the English and the natural, with her being just in this total sort of ecstasy and joy and making these gestures, these kind of prayer gestures to the heavens that we've seen her make throughout. To me, and we have that musical swelling that we referred to earlier. To me, it's like this is the climactic gesture. This is the arrival in paradise. Basically, this is the new world, the integration, the belonging that she's been denied, basically as having been an alien everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting too because she says even before she dies, she says, "Mother, now I know where you live," and this happens right after she decides to stay with John Rolfe.
Yeah,
and that this dilemma is resolved in her.
Yeah.
So there's like a moral kind of resolution that happens there. The film is the way it deals with religion is very much not decisive. It's sort of like letting you draw your own conclusions, much like in the voiceover in The Thin Red Line. There's Christian prayers, especially when things are going badly in the fort. We see that John Smith starting to pray. Pocahontas gets baptized, and that doesn't seem to have much significance for her in the film. It doesn't really. She's doing all the same sort of like more Indian prayer gestures throughout that she's been doing before. It doesn't seem to be a major plot point, I would say, for Malick that she's baptized. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that he's according that like a particular significance.
I don't know about that. I mean, I think just the fact alone that he shows it on screen indicates that he's according it significance, you know? Now, the way that he does, it might be a quieter significance, but I think that that's just generally true of life, right. That, one oftentimes finds themselves quite seemingly the same the day after they've been baptized, but it's true, that I think that there's room for interpretation there, and different ways of viewing it, not unlike we discussed on The Thin Red Line.
Right. I didn't mean that it had to be so like this immediate moral turning point for her or something like that, so much as just like the way that she expresses her religiosity.
Sure.
After that is never shown in like a particularly Christian mode.
Sure.
It's. I mean, we should talk about Rolfe himself as well, but I just wanted to say, like, Pocahontas, if we're talking about the New World, Pocahontas is exploring the New World as much as, John Smith is. I mean, the way that she talks about him is this new thing that's come into her life, and he seems like a god to her, and so she's exploring this newness of him, but also this newness of love and this awakening. And she goes to England.
Yes.
She goes to London.
Amazing scenes.
And my biggest takeaway, my two big takeaways the first time I saw this film, again in the extended edition, were, wow, I can't believe they cast a 14-year-old in that role. That's pretty cool. And then the whole effect of her going to England, going to the city, because what I was impressed by on that first viewing was how the length of the movie, especially the extended edition, like plays in its favor in this respect, because you're spending a couple hours in the Virginia wilderness, when you get used to that environment. And so then when you finally go with her to, England, which of course I didn't even know was going to happen because I didn't know that in history she had actually been invited to visit. You're experiencing the newness of it with her and her wonder. And to the film's credit, as much as the Jamestown fort is, immeasurably inferior and uglier to the Indian village, London is not portrayed as, this negative thing. Her wonder and joy at discovering London and the people there is there. And above all, when she goes into this garden, and this very manicured garden, and it looks like an alien landscape. Yeah, by comparison with like the natural environment that she's been in. It's such a great payoff, for her. It feels like this weird thing, and especially not just when you see her because she's wearing English clothes, but when you see the other Indian who's come across still in his like warrior's clothes or his hunter's clothes, whatever they are, just walking and looking sort of lost in this, bizarre like other planet. It's just such a great aesthetic achievement that of a kind that I haven't seen another film pull off with the change in setting. I think I might have even been to that garden when I went to England, but
cool.
Certainly something very much in that style. Yeah, so I love that effect that it has.
Yeah, even the scene that always moves me every single time, like I'm always surprised at how much it moves me, is when she visits the court of King James, and the regal nature of it, the pomp, the ceremony. Like Malick is not treating it. There's no kind of deconstructive skepticism, like, oh, what's the politics behind this? Like, they're just putting on a show, and obviously colonialism has plenty of odorous things to it, and it's like he's not interested in really trying to present like a very critical, I guess, point of view. I feel like even though like I wouldn't say the film it shies away from criticism. I think it's very aware all throughout of human foibles, I just love that he indulges in the majesty of the court and the music. Right. Like he has this incredible music selection from a play by Ben Jonson, anyway, I'm just capped up. It's a very liturgical moment, actually. It's funny because there isn't much examples of liturgy in Malick's films, but to me, it's almost actually his most liturgical moment. And even knowing that Malick himself is Anglican, it's his most Anglican film in some ways, like, just in terms of the subject matter, like, we're dealing with King James and all that. But I don't know, this is a very like particular, I can't really put words to it, but there's a particular kind of like sweetness to how it's like he feels at home,
It's like the poet laureate reading the poem, which is like a real thing.
So awesome.
And you can't help but laugh when they have like the raccoon in the cage, though. Yeah, But
but there's a raccoon and an American eagle, because these are animals that Europe doesn't have, right. But then there's like a clear symbolism there when Pocahontas stoops down and has this moment with the raccoon, in the cage. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. He's able to keep all these elements together. It's never. I think it's quite rare to see a filmmaker who can be aware of the complexity of that, of like the beauty of the English court, and like the representation of like her feeling something for the raccoon in the cage and what that symbolizes. Even the colonial context. It's like there's just so much going on, but it's not about just one takeaway or the other. Like you're left. You're allowed to kind of just let it be. Right. Complicated, Right, exactly. Because it's always about, you said human foibles, it's always about this human reality. And so I think there's less concern about sort of making institutional criticisms or remarks, or historical critiques. It's about these people. So, the one other character that we haven't talked about yet is Rolfe.
Let's talk about who Rolfe is, in contrast maybe to John Smith, like what type of man he is. Sure. To me, he represents, Pocahontas refers to him at one point as being like a tree that shelters her in its boughs. And I think that is apt because to me, Rolfe represents like a certain stability and a certain responsibility that John Smith lacks, Now, their relationship is less passionate, and that's partially because Pocahontas doesn't have all the same feelings for John Rolfe as she did for John Smith. But I think it also serves to characterize him, even though he does love her passionately, as a more responsible, a less selfish man. Yeah. Because whatever, we see that they have a baby, but most of the physical affection between them is veiled, right? Whereas it's not pornographic or explicit in the John Smith sequences, but there is much of it is physical affection and caresses and all of this stuff, and so I think there's also like a maturing that is represented even by the fact that she has to get beyond the fact that she doesn't have the same feelings for him, partially just because she is still in grief over John Smith. Mm-hmm. So he comes into it with this realism of like, okay, we can still have a good marriage, and maybe, hoping that she'll come to love him later on. Right. And, even just the fact that they live in a house. Like John Smith was like, well, where would we live?
Right.
He's like making up these kind of.
She asks Rolfe, where would we live? And he answers it almost sort of like, well, here, of course, or England, maybe if you want, then maybe that'd be better.
Whereas John Smith, of course, there's reasons for difficulties because the situation is more fluid with the natives and everything than it is later on when the settlers have more strength. But, it's like he's not even trying to answer those questions.
Yes.
He's assuming that it's impossible. And that's as much for his own, ambitions or his own fears.
Yes.
As it is because of anything about the external situation.
Right.
Because we see that the settlers really accept her and love her and revere her.
Right.
Especially once it becomes more of a civilization.
Yeah.
There, so it's not like they would reject her or something like that if she comes to live with them long before John Rolfe enters the picture. I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but the point is Rolfe represents this sort of commitment, this true marriage in contrast. I'm looking at this from a Catholic perspective to what she had with John Smith.
It's a mature love. He's a
mature love. It's this sacrifice. He's willing to sacrifice for her. Perhaps in some way even to excess, but it works out, and basically, the testing point comes when she finds out that John Smith is still alive, and then she isn't sure what to do. But then once they go to England and Smith is, around and there's potential that they could see each other, we do get the scene, and it's more explicit in the extended edition, where Rolfe actually is considering, he has this conversation with Captain Newport where he is actually considering ceding his rights to her and letting her go off and be with John Smith. And I don't think this is just a total cuck move or something like that, because there is the genuine ambiguity from his point of view of whether they are in a true marriage at all, because she entered into marriage with him under the false belief.
Yeah, he says that she finds herself in a position she could not have anticipated.
Now, I don't believe that canonically that would work.
Okay, sure. Yeah, fine. But it's a little bit beside the point.
Well, that's why I began my sentence with now. Anyway, the point is that's not necessarily how the right way for a husband to handle such a scenario, but I think that it shows the disposition of his heart, to be generous, not to force his love on her, even though he could in a sort of a legal sense. Why can't I just mention that by the by? I don't
know. There's something funny about it.
Well, anyway, I guess, I put it in a particularly funny way. Yeah, so we get to this point where she's able to have this freedom to decide, or at least, and again, it's not as clear in the movie that she's actually considering leaving for John Smith. I think which is better because we don't potentially lose respect for her. What she's looking for is a sort of a resolution, a sort of closure, and that happens in this final encounter with John Smith, to where in the end she's able to go back to John Rolfe and say you're my husband.
Yeah.
And that's such a relief, to the viewer when that happens.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. There is a progression in his films to this point of characters in this situation of the cuckolded husband. In Days of Heaven, the landowner, played by Sam Shepard, is his response to finding out about the affair is violence, right? In The Thin Red Line, the husband whose wife leaves him while he's in the field, his response is basically despair. He can't imagine life without her. And John Rolfe is kind of the first time we've seen this type in Malick's films, where not only is he shown to be really kind of almost the most deeply Christian character, certainly to this point in his filmmaking, but maybe in all his films, well, except for Hidden Life. You see this man who's deeply charitable, and his response to being placed in this situation is of patience. It's sacrificial love, maybe even to when you were saying with the canonical question, that maybe to an unrealistic degree or whatever, or an unreasonable degree, but that I think Malick is reaching for this question of, how far can love go, right? And Rolfe is he's the antithesis of John Smith in so many ways, but especially in this, where his love is so self-negating, that like he, maybe even loses the sense of, is willing to give up even like, what his marriage is, right? And which is like, we don't have to agree with that, but it's like that's the thing, is like there's a self-negating, a pouring out of self that we haven't seen in his films before this point, and there's this character has been developing over time.
In the extended cut, we get a line from Rolfe in the voiceover where he says about this bond that he has with Pocahontas, he says love made the bond and love can break it too, or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's not, I guess it's not,
meaning her love with John Smith made the bond between them, and love, this is how I read it, and his love for her, or her love for him, can break the bond with John Smith. That was my reading, but it might be
the other way around. It might be, that so it's
I took it as his confidence. I took it as his confidence that once she re-encountered him, that she would realize where her heart really was. Like that's how I've always encountered that line.
I see. Interesting. Yeah. Well, one of the things that I love about Malick is that anytime we get these voiceovers, we don't necessarily need to treat them with like equal degrees of credence, like sometimes,
especially not when they're not complete sentences and it's just saying
mother,
life, or like, and that's the whole thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But I like that sometimes we get unreliable. We get a little bit of unreliable narrators sometimes, and sometimes that's to really terrific effect. When John Smith is really conflicted and he's got these sort of battling voices inside him, just different perspectives, layered on top of each other. That's very effective.
Yeah.
But yeah, maybe we can just quickly speak to we've already talked about the difference among these different cuts.
For me, the two biggest differences were probably, there are certain segments that are wholly added. Like I think the entire character of the crazy Indian guy who goes to live with the settlers is added in the extended cut.
Yes.
You see him in the theatrical cut a handful of times,
right?
But I don't think there's no reason to pay much attention to him.
Right. Yeah. So I think, and I'm speaking here of the difference between the theatrical and the extended cut. I haven't seen the first cut, which is the intermediate length cut. To me, my biggest impressions were like, you spend a lot more time, like it's just more leisurely. So like, especially at the beginning, for instance, when they're first exploring and encountering Virginia, I think that there's just a lot more leisure. There's a lot more time for voiceover, as they're going up the river and things like that. So the pacing of it is different. It just allows for a deeper immersion. And then for me, the biggest thing in terms of plot and character was that Pocahontas felt like a more complex character throughout the film and not just in the final third of the film. But just to say quickly, the extended cut is not like the original cut or anything like that. So it's not like anything that's not in it was like cut from it or something like that. That was created later. But so basically you have the first cut, and I believe if that is the original like cut that was the premiere of the film. Yeah. And around that time of the premiere, just before the premiere, the studio asked and that's about like 150 or 155 minutes,
150
something like
minutes.
That. Yeah. And the studio asked them to cut about a half hour from that.
14. They asked to cut 14 or 15 minutes from it.
Okay, 14, 15 minutes. And so I haven't seen that version. So then what you get is the theatrical cut is the shortest version, and that's the one that saw a wider theatrical release. Then you have the extended cut, which is made, for home release, basically. I don't know if it was released, only released on the Criterion?
No, it was released on home video in like 2008, 2009. I think it was 2008. And the editor, like the editorial assistant who's interviewed on the Criterion set, was saying that it was kind of like a deal in a way, like the Warner's, who owns New Line Cinema, who funded the film. They basically, I think, gave it to Malick because he accepted the request to make a shorter theatrical cut. This is kind of like the reward, I think, is the impression.
Nice. Malick says that the extended cut is for him the definitive version of the New World. This is the first. Well, this is the first of his films that have multiple cuts available to us.
So I've loved the extended cut for over a decade now. I think it's one of my favorite films. I'd never seen the first cut until preparing for this recording. I saw the theatrical cut when it came out on home video in like 2006, and I remember watching it with my dad. I was in high school at the time, and I was really into like historical, drama action movies, and I remember just being so utterly befuddled. Even I'd seen The Thin Red Line already at that point, but I was so befuddled by the film, and it just kind of like didn't really leave any impression. And then, like I said earlier, a couple years later, I watched the extended cut. It was just a completely different experience. So for me, the extended cut has always been like the only real definitive cut. Rewatching the theatrical this time, that was definitely confirmed for me in the sense that I think the theatrical cut is a waste of time. There are those who would say that it's not just simply a case of excising material from the first cut. Like they did actually re-edit parts of the theatrical cut is like a new edit in the sense that Malick embraced it as an opportunity to try something different. So, but that said, I think its deficiencies, as far as what you experience in the longer cuts, are very evident. It's an incredibly jagged experience if you're used to the other cuts, and it was interesting even hearing you say, James, that you were bored by the theatrical cut because it's like I think that's a function of like just all the stuff is missing, and it's like it's not fleshed out, especially with the first half of the film is just so scattershot to me. Like it's so much details and moments and that fleshing out, that leisurely quality even of an exploring, like it's missing. So much is missing from the first half of the film. The second half is much more intact in the rest of the cuts for the most part, like from the battle onwards kind of. But yeah, so my view is that the theatrical cut no one needs to bother with it unless you're really curious.
Yeah, I think I agree because the theatrical cut for me, the pacing is completely off. Because the key relationship in this film is the relationship between John Smith and Pocahontas. Everything has to sort of go back to that. And in the extended cut, we're just given a lot more time for that relationship to ripen and to be believable and for me to be drawn into it. So I'm not even necessarily talking about, what scenes between John Smith and Pocahontas were cut out or left in. Even just having the time, is important. So the scenes that are missing, they might not have anything to do with John Smith and Pocahontas, and yet they do, because it's this passage of time that's taking place in the film that also is taking place, in the context of their relationship and their hearts and their growth, and I'm sort of accompanying that as the spectator, and it locks me into it. Where in the theatrical cut, I really felt like there were moments of genuine suspension of disbelief, like, oh, okay, I guess we're here now, that was fast. For mainly just that alone, the fact that it gives the kind of romantic arc of these characters more time to develop and ripen, right. That to me is key.
Oh, you know what? Big point we haven't made is that the extended cut has the chapter divisions.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's interesting.
A major difference as well.
It's a whole different experience. I just want to say quickly about the first cut. So this is the first time I saw the first cut, and I almost skipped it actually because I was running out of time to prepare, and I was like, whatever, what's going to be revelatory? Well, I got to say, I was very surprised. I think it's I'm not sure how to qualify this. I love the extended version, and I want both versions in my life. But the first cut, purely for like as a story character experience, I find the first cut to be the most perfect cut in terms of balancing both the perspective of Pocahontas and John Smith. The theatrical cut is very John Smith heavy, and Pocahontas gets kind of lost. The first cut feels to me like it's from a story point of view of like what's happening, what does this mean, who are they, what are they feeling. All of that I love about the extended version that I had only seen in the extended version to this point, it's all in the first cut. And then the extended cut, which adds about 20 more minutes of material from the first cut. I love most of that material. Like I don't think there's any material there that I dislike. But it became much more clear for me on this viewing that the extended cut it's the most interior of the three cuts. there's opaque moments in the extended cut that are not in the other cuts. The theatrical cut's great flaws. I think it becomes opaque because it leaves out too much. The first cut doesn't have any moments that strike me as opaque. I feel like there's a clarity and a gentle and a expansiveness to it that works. It's just very well balanced. And the extended cut, I do feel there are moments where it gets very opaque about what a character is doing, and you're kind of just left to kind of like, you know,
like the mushroom,
like exactly like that. That was a moment, a perfect example. But basically it's a more lyrical, it's a more ruminative film. It's a more dreamy film, the extended cut. I would say anyone who's coming to it for the first time, I would say watch the first cut, the 150-minute cut. Okay. Unfortunately, I mean, it's great that it is available on the Criterion set, but it may not be as widely available in other means. But if you can't watch that version, then I would say watch the extended cut.
Well, I'll watch that next time. I'll watch the first cut next time.
But I want to be clear that I love, like, for me, the extended cut is the definitive cut, and it's the one that I will still be watching the most. But it was interesting to see. I do think this is why I don't hate the theatrical cut. This is why I'm annoyed that the studio was like, hey, can you cut this down? Because like they really did nail the first cut. Like they made a perfect film on the first cut. And that's kind of been the link. That's what I've heard over the years from people who had seen the first cut, where they'd be like, oh, it was a home run, and then they kind of like took, messed with it. I think it's kind of true. I think they really hit it. Same way that they hit the Tree of Life. The theatrical cut of the Tree of Life is one of the most perfect edits I've ever seen of any film,
well, that's cool. That's cool. That is the next film we're going to be talking about in this series, right? I'm so excited that here we are. We just spent 2 hours talking about the New World, and we're here. We're in Malick land. You know what I mean? Yeah. Watching this movie in particular, the extended cut, was one of the most enjoyable movie experiences I've had in a long time. And I think that says a lot because I watch a lot of movies for this podcast. It was just so enjoyable. And part of that, it's just the combination of all the elements we've talked about, the beauty, visually, the amazing music, the incredible, weaving of these thematic elements with the story, the period drama of John Smith and Pocahontas. And what we haven't really talked about is like the performances too. Just great performances. Colin Farrell is just such a great actor. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm excited for what comes next.
Yeah. I think it's incredible that we live in that Malick exists, that we get films from this director, that people were willing to work with him. Maybe it was funny, the editor's supplement, the interview with the editors on the Criterion edition, the two of the editors they interview are, Hollywood veterans, and including one of them has cut like many films for Oliver Stone, who's, notoriously difficult, I would imagine a difficult director to work for. And it's funny, these editors were saying the difference of working for Malick is like, there's no room for ego. Like you can't, your ego is going to take a beating, wow. because he's so, in their words, he's so open to valuable contributions coming from kind of anywhere. And they gave an example. It wasn't clear to me that it sounded like this was an actual thing that happened, but they were kind of paraphrasing to make a joke out of it. But they were talking about an example of like, they're like, oh yeah, you could show up to work and there'd be like a kid with a skateboard at the computer editing. and it's like, oh yeah, he's like the friend of a cousin of mine, and he had this really cool idea, and Malick liked some aspect of like what this kid did, so he was like, yeah, let's see what happens. Like, let's just try let's see what he does with the scene, And it's like,
hey man, directors use non-actors,
Exactly. Now, I mean, it's just so unorthodox.
How do you think that makes an actor feel? I think editors should get a taste of that medicine.
So I don't know. I don't know if that actually happened, but that's the example they give of like the kind of things you just never know what would happen. And obviously, if you're used to a certain way of working, that can be disruptive and unpleasant. But I think it goes back to what we were saying about the lack of what moves me about Malick is like the lack of I think that disposition that he creates in his filmmaking, which this isn't just me speculating, like people have talked about this, like it creates a space for freedom and for the accident, the kiss of reality to really enter in at all points. The receptivity, like it's not just simply about the effect of like the film a certain way. It's baked into the process. It's deeply like inseparable from the process, and I just find it inspirational. I think he's showing us a way of filmmaking that is truly artistic, truly poetic at the deepest levels, and I just can't wait to keep mining things from that, and I hope that other Catholics and other filmmakers and anyone who crosses those those worlds like does as well. Like, we need more Malick.
Yeah, I just want to say that I'm glad that we discussed this film on its own, not only because it, ended up being more interesting than I remembered based on my first viewing, but also because I think that we needed to spend like an hour talking about his style, because of course we'll keep talking about it, but we're entering this new phase of his career now.
Yeah.
And perhaps we needed to have a film where we didn't spend as much time talking about the themes so that we would just have the time to talk about his style and introduce that.
And, I think we still ended up spending as much time with the theme.
Yeah.
But I think that this conversation is going to serve us well going forward. I think we're well primed to talk about the Tree of Life and then the films that come afterward.
Isn't it cool that the final shot is a giant tree? I always think that's cool.
Yes. There's foreshadowing.
James already mentioned that.
No, but I didn't even make the connection. He's literally setting us up for the sequel.
The next tree.
Big tree.
Criteria is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.